I'm civil rights attorney Carol Powell-Lexing, and welcome to the Carol Powell-Lexing Show. And today we are going to be discussing the legacy of the injustice embedded in the U.S. research and medical systems. But before I get started, I always like to remind you about how fearfully, wonderfully, and marvelously that you are made by God. You are a God's original. And because God don't make any junk. You are a very special person, and you're just special. And I want you to always keep that in mind and not let anyone else tell you any different. And I tell you, God made us. He made us to go forth to do great things. And today we're going to be talking about a lady that God has fearfully, marvelously, and wonderfully made. And her name is Henrietta Lacks. This is a name that everybody in the world should know about. This is an extraordinary story. And I'm telling you, her name should be synonymous with medical research. Her name should be synonymous with human body cells. Her name should be synonymous with immortality. And the list goes on. And today we're going to discuss how wonderfully and how Miss Lack's contribution to society has taken over the world, but with one little injustice that's tagged along with her name, and that is her human rights, her civil rights. And her human rights and natural rights are rights that God has inherent in us. For instance, the air that we breathe are human rights. That's what God gave us. No one can charge us for breathing the air. So Ms. Lack's human rights, natural rights, and her civil rights were violated because her contributions were taken. And we're going to discuss what contributions she has made to this world that was done without her consent. Nevertheless, we are reaping the benefits of the contributions that Miss Henrietta Lacks have contributed to the medical profession and to the world. And here to discuss this with us today is none other than her grandson, Mr. Ron Lacks. Mr. Lacks, it is a privilege and an honor to have you here today, and we just honored that you graced us with your presence today. So tell us a little about yourself, and just tell us about your grandmother, Miss Henrietta Lacks.
I just want to thank you, first of all, for having me. This journey of mine has been long overdue. I sat there as a teenager when my mother first found out about this in the 1970s, when she was having lunch with a friend of hers that was a professor, that when she was introduced as Barbette Lacks, and the professor said, "We're working with someone named Henrietta Lacks." And that's when he told her that we was working with cells from Henrietta Lacks. And that's when my mother said, "That's my mother-in-law." And that's when we first found out about the cells. Can you imagine that someone coming, my grandmother been gone since 1951, and someone approached you and said, her cells are still living? I mean, that was baffling to my family.
I can imagine. And let me just give the listeners or the viewers a backdrop about Miss Henrietta Lacks. Miss Henrietta Lacks was diagnosed with cervical cancer back in 1950. And after she was diagnosed with cervical cancer, the doctor took a biopsy of her cells. And in that biopsy of her cells, he discovered that her cells last longer than any other human cells, because back then human cells only lasted a day or two. So scientists could not conduct an experiment because those cells died out. But when he took Miss Henrietta Lacks' cells, he saw that her cells lived for days. And not only did they live for days, they reproduced themselves which gave them an opportunity to be able to conduct experiments and come up with some of the most creative life-saving medicines that we have today, such as the polio vaccine, intro fertilization, genes mapping. Her cells have contributed to cancer and AIDS research, and even, from my understanding, COVID-19. So her cells are living, and they're living on today because God just created her that way. And the tragedy to her story is that these researchers were using her cells to create an experiment without her consent and without the consent of the family, because they took the cells from her and they actually started using the cells prior to her death, from my understanding. Am I right, Mr. Lax?
That's right. Without our knowledge. It wasn't until 1970s when we found out about it that they had her cells since 1951.
Right. And so since 1951, what is that like? Is that like 60 years? I'm not good with math, but many years later is when when you found out about it, what they were doing. And let me ask you this, from my understanding, your family back in the 80s, were they pretty much back in the 70s? Had they been harassed about giving blood tests and having them the scientists were making requests for them to come in and give blood samples, but they never told you all why you were doing it?
They sure did. And like you said, and once it hit the fan, and when Jet Magazine and Rolling Stone wrote about it, they knew the cat was out of the bag.
Right.
So they came to my family's home and asked for blood samples from Henrietta's children. And they misled them and said, we would just want to check and see if y'all might have the same kind of cancer that your mother had.
What?
And my father and his siblings gave up their blood freely just to help out.
So they just outright lied to you all, still not telling you that Miss Lax's cells had been stolen, or they have been using her cells in order to do experiments and come up with all these worldwide inventions, medical inventions, life-saving medicines. And not one time did they tell the family the reason why.
Not at all. Now, they wanted to even extend it even further. They tried to get it from the grandchildren, but my mother put a stop to that. She said, no, I don't trust you. I'm not letting you experiment on my children. And that's when they just got the blood samples from Henrietta's children, and they gave it willingly. But my mother was always skeptical.
And how many children did Miss Henrietta have?
She had 5.
She had 5 children? Mm-hmm. And these scientists or doctors basically took samples from those 5 children under the auspice that they were trying to test it.
Except Elsie. She was committed to Crownsville. So once Henrietta got sick, she couldn't handle Elsie because she was at that age where she couldn't control her, and that's where they sent people with mental illness at that time.
Oh, okay, I see. All right, Miss Lax had a child that was mentally challenged at that time, and they didn't take her cells.
No, I didn't say that because I'm quite sure that they visited her in Crownfield. There's no doubt about it that they did that. No doubt.
Right. If they were so brazen to steal Miss Lax's cells when she was living, we know that they went and probably took some cells from Elsie.
Exactly, because she was awarded to the state.
Right.
So
well, we know.
That was their backyard.
Right. We know what they did, and to make matters worse, her cells were named. Am I pronouncing this right? HeLa. They're called the HeLa cells. And
exactly.
The reason
and last name. but they changed. What they did was they called her Helen Lane or Helen Lawson instead of Henrietta Lacks. But they still did them 2 letters of each, the first name and the last name.
Right. And from my understanding, the doctor then, when he took samples, he labeled his samples with the first 2 letters of the patient's first and last name. So the HE comes from Henrietta and the LA comes from Lax. But you're saying they even went and tried to change her identity and change the identity of her, not wanting to give credit to her for having taken her cells. They used a fictitious name.
Exactly. Helen Lawson or Helen Lane. That was the name they gave to that.
Wow. They really went out. Because, you know, you got all kinds of problems with this whole scenario. I mean, this is just criminal.
It is. Mm-hmm. It is. I mean, they went so far as they took advantage of the Lax family for so long, it became normal. Even Thermo Fisher had up on their website that these cells were stolen.
Okay, Thermo Fisher is the company that purchased her cells and selling her cells and using it or selling it to researchers to conduct research and experiments in order to come up with these life-saving medicines. And not one time have you all been compensated for that, right?
Correct. I think it was it's a $35,000 business a year that Thermo Fisher was making off of HeLa cells.
You mean $35 billion?
Billion with a B.
With a B, yes. 35 is the $35 billion industry, and the injustice is that not one penny have they offered to the family for using your grandmother's cells.
Right. You would think that they would try to compensate, because I'm quite sure my grandma just saying, well, what about my family? Some family members don't have adequate medical care. I mean, they not once reached out to the family and said, we got you.
Well, they're not, because the whole basis was it was stolen. It wasn't like she was a donor. They stole her cells and they used her cells, and they didn't give her credit, nor the family credit, for having stolen your grandmother's cells. So naturally, they're not going to reach out to you because that's what I started off talking about, the legacy of the injustice that's embedded in the U.S. research and the medical system. They have taken a portion of this lady's composition, her cells, her makeup, her personal property, her really intellectual property issue you have here, because they've stolen, her cells, her makeup.
Right.
And of course, they're not going to reach out and say, hey, would you all like to reap a benefit from what we are illegally doing? Because that's what they're doing.
Exactly.
When you take something without the consent of a person, that's theft.
Yeah. And I would like to point out that God has made this path for me. He took obstacles out of my way for me to move forward in getting genetic justice for my grandmother. I just wasn't suited for this at one time, but he took me in his arms, and it's just like everything was divine interventions in my life that brought me to this path right now.
Right. Your grandmother's story is so phenomenal. They made a movie about it called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Is that right?
That's right.
And Miss Winfred, Oprah Winfred, actually played the aunt. She played a starring role. And Renee Goldsberry played your grandmother. Is that right? Well,
That's
how
right.
did you feel about the movie itself and how it told your grandmother's story?
Meeting Oprah, she was an inspiration. She really was. But I think that she didn't do her due diligence on putting a check on Rebecca Skloot. She claimed that she had the story about the Lax family, which made me write this book. I was sitting there watching the morning news with Charlie Rowe, Oprah Winfrey, Gayle King, and they were sitting on there calling my aunt crazy. And I knew that that was wrong. That was the last straw for me. I knew that I had to come out with everything that I knew. And I set my dad down, Lawrence Lax, to help me tell the story of Henrietta Lax and the Lax family.
You mentioned earlier, you called out a name of a person named Rebecca Sloot. Can you tell us who that is?
Rebecca Sloot, who came into my family back in, I think it was in 2010 was her book. And my Aunt Deborah took her under her wings because she consulted the family. And we were so skeptical of people coming into the Lax family that wasn't telling the true story about what really happened. And it wasn't until my aunt passed away that we found out that Rebecca had not only gotten everything from Deborah that she could, but she didn't compensate her for anything.
Wow. Now, is the aunt that you're talking about, is that the role that Oprah Winfrey played in the movie of Immortal Life, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lack?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, all right.
And when my aunt passed away, she Rebecca Scrooge had carte blanche to talk about anything that she wanted to about Dale. That's why I had to put a check to make sure that my aunt's story be told. And she wasn't, you could ask anybody except Rebecca Scrooge. My aunt was not schizophrenic as they played her in the movie.
Oh, okay. And that inspired you to write your book?
Yes. I mean, I sat there and, like I said, as a teenager, watched what my dad went through. When I went down to Johns Hopkins for a meeting with my dad and his attorney with NIH, and they sat there and didn't listen to a thing my father had to say. They went a couple generations down to get a yes for taking control of Henrietta Lax's cells.
Now, who is NIH? What is NIH?
The National Institute of Health.
And they met with your family, with your dad?
At Johns Hopkins.
For the purpose of getting you all's consent, or just wanting to just feel to see?
No, getting consent to take control of healer cells. And that's what they did. They did that.
Did you all give them the consent?
No, my dad did not, but they went 2 generations down to get a consent.
When you say they went 2 generations down to get a consent, who are we speaking about? Great-grandchildren?
Great-grandchildren, yes.
Well, they can't do that.
They did it. I'm trying to tell you, they had no qualms about taking advantage of the Lax family. And my dad had his attorney there with him. So once the attorney seen that the family was divided, he was out.
The attorney was out.
He said, no. He said, since your family is not together on this, I can't represent because y'all divided. And that's what they did. They divided and conquered.
Mm-hmm. But you are the sole heir of the estate of Henrietta Lax as of today, correct?
Correct. My dad, when we was at that meeting, my dad was as head of the state. He was.
Okay.
And my dad got older. He passed it down to me. Said, son, I need you to take over.
Right.
See what you can do.
Right. And what did you do?
Yes. And, when I got to walk my dad through them courtroom doors, it was amazing because it's something that never has been done with the Lax family.
Okay, I'm gonna back you up. I ask you, what did you do when you took over? And you said, when you got to walk your dad through the courtroom doors, it was something that has not been done. I need you to explain to us what happened, because I'm excited about knowing how you all rectified that problem. How did you make these people who stole Mrs. Lack's sales, how did you hold them accountable for that?
Okay. I seen that my family was getting nowhere with attorneys here in Baltimore, Maryland. So when I came out with my book, and it was slow moving, I worked tirelessly to get the book into the right hands, and I was able to reach out to Texas, and they invited me down for a book signing, and I met a guy named Sam Collins, and he said, "Look, I know Mr. Crump. Would you like me to introduce you to him? I'm gonna send my book over there to him, and let him read it." And he did. And a couple weeks later, Mr. Crump called me on the phone, and I didn't know it was him. And I wound up, this is a joke, and I hung up on him.
Well, I'm sure Ben that's not the first time somebody's hung up on him, okay? Because Ben is a good friend of mine. That's why I can joke about him.
Yeah. Thank goodness he called back. So when he took the reins for me, I come to realize that, you have to stand on the shoulders of giants to be heard. Henrietta was already a giant.
Right.
But I need a mouthpiece like Mr. Crump.
Right.
And he did. So when he took over, he teamed up with Chris Seeger, who's another top-notch attorney.
Right.
And they was able to walk us through them courtroom doors. And when we was in the courtroom, and the judge asked Thermo Fisher, "Is it true that Henrietta Lacks cells multiply every 24 hours?" And the whole back row, the Lacks family said, "Mm-hmm."
Oh, man. Wow. You're talking about immortality. That's where the immortal part of it comes, because no other cells have done that. And so you guys have gone to court.
Yes.
It's a case. Yes. Have you completed the case?
No, it's pending now.
It's pending now. Okay.
Waiting for a ruling on it, whether we going she going to dismiss it or move forward.
Well, we're going to pray that it will not get dismissed. But I don't know how it could get dismissed, because you have Thermo Fisher.
She was a thorough judge. She was a very thorough judge. She asked good questions on both sides of the aisle.
Right.
So from a human perspective, I see that she was curious. And this is unprecedented.
It's very unprecedented, and it's a very interesting story, because here you have this company, Thermo Fisher Scientific, that's been accumulating, selling, distributing, and has made billions of dollars, and has not enriched the family.
And that's only one.
Yeah, that's only one company. There are thousands of other ones that have done the same. Exactly. And so it's a very interesting story. I'm glad that you all have taken action to rectify this wrong, and I tell you, it's very, very interesting. And I
still got a long way to go, because at least I'm reaching out to the historical Black colleges. I think that because Henrietta book, Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, is mandatory in colleges. So from a family perspective, I think that my book should be right there beside and telling this Black family story.
I think so too, because you have the untold story of Henrietta Lacks. You have the insight, because that was your grandmother.
That's right.
And so hopefully you can make that happen.
Even my book. I went on and got the admission slip that Henrietta signed. I put it in the back of my book with her signature, and it's a beautiful John Hancock. It really is. It's beautiful. I mean, you could tell by her pictures. I never understood why they kept calling her a poor black farmer. When I walked past that picture as a child in my mom's house, she looked like Greta Garbo. She looked like a movie star back then.
Right. And she died at a very young age. She died when she was 31. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Right. So I tell you, Mr. Lax, this is an incredible story because your grandmother has basically saved the world with her sales.
Yes, yes.
Right.
Yes. And I just hope that I'm suitable to fight for this for my grandmother, because it's been a long time coming. And I watched my family go through some things with this. I mean, when they divided my family and we was at odds with each other, it wasn't until Ben Crump came in that the family said, oh, Ronnie's on to something. And we came together.
That's great. Mr.
And I would like to talk about, too, when you get a chance, how Rebecca Skloot decided to pay Deborah for her contributions to her.
Okay, all right.
The family outright.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said. What did you say?
I said I would like to talk about how Rebecca Skloot decided to compensate my aunt, Deborah. Instead of her paying her outright, they wanted to open up a foundation and have the Lax family apply for money instead of paying us outright, like we couldn't or would not know what to do with a lump sum of money.
Okay, all right. We'll discuss that, but I want to go back to the fact that you said that you put the initial signature of your grandmother in the back of your book when there were rumors that she couldn't read or write. Can you tell us?
That's what they said.
But she was able to sign her name. Is that right?
That's correct. Even on her marriage certificate, she wrote in cursive.
Okay, all right. And is that why you felt the need to put that signature in the back of your book?
Yes, not only the signature, but I had to put pictures of my family as well, because they try to paint us like ignorant black people that didn't know how to read and write.
Right. Who tried to paint you all like that?
Rebecca Skloot.
Okay, all right.
It's in her book. I mean, the things she talked about in her book, you would think, talking about Henrietta, she could have came up with a different narrative about how special this woman was. But she tried to go in the closet and pull out some of the darkest things in her family's life.
Right, instead of telling the truth about how remarkable.
Exactly. Like, for instance, my grandmother and grandfather, they was cousins. You couldn't travel back then, so black people had to conversate within that community. They couldn't walk or drive somewhere and go see somebody.
Right. Okay. All right. And you're saying that Miss Henrietta Lax and her husband were cousins?
They was cousins.
Okay. All right. Okay.
It was called Laxtown. That's how prominent we was back then. It was 4 brothers that was Laxes that married my side of the family, and they gave us that's the land that we had back then, and that's where the black Laxes lived at, and the white Laxes lived somewhere else.
So your family owned land back in the 50s in Baltimore, Maryland?
Correct. Yeah. Acres and acres of land. Yeah, we had. Yeah. It's called Laxtown. And like I was saying, when a family member walked out their house, they could look left and right and center. All you would see was family members.
Right. And was this land owned by Miss Henrietta Lax? Or her father?
It was owned by her father.
Okay. Her parents, rather, yes.
Her parents. Yep.
Okay, all right.
And it branched off from there. So Lex has owned all that down there, and it was hundreds of acres of land.
So the rumor that Miss Henrietta Lacks was uneducated, came from a poor tobacco family, is not true?
It's not true at all. They harvest their own land.
Right. They farm their own land.
Exactly.
And they farm their own land. Did they grow tobacco on that land? What did they farm?
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. They sold their own tobacco.
Okay, all right. So the book.
So my grandfather migrated from Virginia to Baltimore, Maryland, when he came up to Sparrows Point. You know, that was the best jobs a black man could get at that time, because Sparrows Point was booming.
Right. So the movie, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, did not tell the real story of Miss Lacks' true life.
Not at all.
But your book does.
Yes, it did.
And in your book, tell us a little more about your book.
Okay, in my book, I tell the truth, because the truth will set you free.
Right.
I talk about some family members. I talk about the entities that interfered in my family's life. I tell the truth about everything, even my dad. How he was portrayed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. But I want to go back and talk about Miss Rebecca Slooks. You mentioned earlier that she compensated your aunt to the tune of setting up some type of foundation in honor of Miss Henrietta Lacks.
Yes, I'm gonna go as far as say that because of her help. Because wouldn't no family member talk to any outsider, because we have been through the ringer. So we totally shut everybody out, because all they wanted was what they could get out the family. And we was tired of that. Mm-hmm. So when Deborah brought Rebecca Slooks to the house, and what she did was even worse, in my opinion, was worse than John Hopkins, because she befriended us.
Mm-hmm. She befriended the family. For how long did you all know Miss Rebecca prior to her making this movie or writing this book?
We didn't know her at all. She contacted my aunt, and she hounded her for a whole year before Dale accepted to meet her.
Okay. And when the aunt accepted to meet her, did the aunt bring in you all as a family to talk to to talk to Miss Rebecca?
Yes, she came. Deborah came to talk with her brothers, Sonny, Abdul, and Lawrence. And they gave their opinion, they didn't want nothing to do with it. So they gave their blessing, say, you go ahead on, do what you want to do, but we don't want no part of it. And that's what my aunt did.
Oh, I see. So Miss Henrietta Lacks' daughter just took the reign, and she thought that Miss Rebecca Slooks was going to, I guess, portray or tell the story, the truth about the life of Miss Lacks and how her cells were stolen. Right.
And like right to this day, Rebecca Slooks has not once came out and said, oh, thank God the Lacks family went to court and they finally gonna get genetic justice. Not once.
Not once, huh? You haven't heard from her since you all started your lawsuit against Thermo Fisher?
Yes.
Yes, you have heard, or no, you haven't heard from her?
Yes, we started a case against Thermo Fisher, but we have not heard from Rebecca Slooks.
Right.
Not once has she mentioned, I'm so happy that this happened to the Lacks family, because she came on like she was fighting for the Lax family rights. And
You
because
think that
we
you think the only reason she came on like that was to write a book and do a movie for
yeah,
herself, not necessarily on behalf of trying to tell the true story about how incredible Henrietta Lacks was.
exactly. I mean, she wrote herself in the story. I mean, what author does that? I mean, she wanted to do a story on Henrietta, but she wound up doing a story about her and my aunt, you know.
Oh, so that whole movie was built around her relationship with your aunt.
Exactly, exactly. It wasn't about Henrietta. I think they took precaution because they didn't want to really mess with Henrietta because that would have been something the family would have been really upset about. So they
Right.
didn't touch on that in the movie too much.
Right, right. I wanted to just bring out a little fact before we stop, and that is a consent issue versus a privacy concern, because that's very important. How basically your family medical records were published without your family consent. So starting from 1951, the medical research scientists continued to use your family medical records without you all's consent to conduct their experiments. And
Exactly.
as of today's date, they wouldn't be able to do that because people are protected by what's called HIPAA, the HIPAA laws, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, but it was only established in 1996.
Right. So everybody but the Lax family benefits from HIPAA.
Right. But HIPAA was established to protect people so that people can decide on what health information what would be disclosed or even used. And
Correct.
We see that, like you said, everybody has benefited except the Lax family, because the original foundation of the story about Miss Henrietta Lacks is based on the fact that they actually stole her cells
Yep.
and used them without her permission and the family permission. Well, we
Yep.
are so glad that you all are in the court system, and we're going to stand in agreement with prayer that it's going to work out for your good and that justice is going to prevail and that this family will be
Amen.
compensated for all the times that these other companies have used Miss Lack's cells without you all's permission. I appreciate you being on here, being on the show and telling, and we just having a discussion about what really happened as it relates to the movie, the book, and you getting your untold story out about Henrietta Lacks, your grandmother. Thank you so much. We appreciate you being on here, and we look forward to maybe having you back, because this is a discussion that can't go on and on, because we really want to know what's going to happen with the case. We really want to
Exactly.
know the outcome of what's going to happen with this case.
That's an interesting story in itself. So I'll be glad to come back on and let you know what's going on.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us today. Be sure and follow us here at the Carol Powell Lexing Show. And don't forget to follow me at Carol P. Lexing on Twitter.